All right. So this will be I think, hopefully, this will be a very interesting um, video for you guys, or hopefully, it'll be a very interesting kind of like thought process. Um, so this video is how our anxieties reciprocally determine our relation. Um, as some of you know, I try to base a lot of my thinking from my own kind of like experiences and problems that I sort of encounter in my own life. And some recent changes that have happened in my own life is that, well, I'm in a relationship, right? I have a partner now, and with having a partner, I've noticed that there's some things that kind of keep coming up as problems or issues within that relationship. And one of those issues is the fact that we both have anxieties about certain things. And what's kind of fascinating to think through in terms of our relationships with people and our anxieties is that it seems like our anxieties concerning our partner, um, reciprocally determine our relations and how we construct those relationships. So, for example, and I'm going to use personal examples with myself, is that um, before I was involved with my partner, I didn't really, in my opinion, I didn't really have any anxieties about anything in particular. um, but it wasn't until like I got very intimate with my partner that all of a sudden the anxiety started unfolding right before my eyes. Right. Um, Typically, I would call this the idea of the realization that you are falling in love, or the realization that you have already fallen in love. And so if we're taking the kind of fallen in love metaphor seriously, then realizing that you have already fallen is this vulnerable position into which you realize that you fell. Um, and it leaves a kind of very vulnerable position for you, and how that starts to construct your relation. Um, so a very personal example of the way I've been thinking about this is that once I started falling in love with my partner, um, this one specific anxiety started popping up. That anxiety was the fact of I didn't want to come across as needy. I didn't want to come across as needy to my partner, right? So any issue that I would have, I would try not to bring it up to my partner because I don't want to come across as needy and so on. But here's the real kicker. Um, my partner's anxiety, after talking to each other, is that her anxiety is actually predicated on the fact of not feeling needed. So her anxiety is the fact that, like, what if I have no utility for my partner, right? What if my partner doesn't need me? That's her anxiety. Whereas my anxiety is that I don't want to be too needy to my partner. And so instantly, what you see here is a direct conflict with our anxieties. How my anxiety directly opposes my partner's anxiety, and that this reciprocal process um, sort of determines our relationship together. Um, and so it seems like putting our anxieties on the table there. And my partner and I have talked about this, where it's like, I don't think these anxieties are ever going to go away. Um, but I think once we acknowledge that these anxieties may never go away, then we start understanding, like, okay, that means that the task that is before us is to construct our relationship around mitigating these anxieties, right? Where ironically, my freedom from my anxiety is precisely found in my partner, and also her freedom and her anxiety is precisely found in me, right? So it's ironically playing with the idea, or Lacan's idea, that anxiety is what is outside the frame of our understanding of ourselves. It's that frame, and then that means freedom is precisely what is outside that frame. So I guess what I say, or what I mean by constructing our relationships by our anxiety, means not necessarily avoiding them, but understanding that it's precisely my anxiety um, that brings forth the possibility of freedom, which can be found in the other. Um, and it's always going to be an anxiety, because if we take, I guess, Lacan's notion that anxiety is this kind of freedom or outside the frame, then um, our anxieties are always that sort of reminder of that possibility of freedom that is there. So even though my anxiety of being, needy or whatever, um, restrains me and, um, binds me, my partner that also wants to feel needed, uh, we reciprocally can also free each other, right? Where, for example, like she tells me, like, um, she, my partner tells me, like, she actually doesn't feel that I'm actually like needy at all. Like, she actually feels like I'm probably one of the few people that actually take, any actual energy away from them. Um, and so she looks at me as kind of like a, like like it's non-threatening. Like, what I'm feel threatened by is not really like a problem for her. Whereas me, I still have to grapple with the fact that even though it's not a problem for her, it's still a problem. Like, I still feel like it's a real problem for me. Um, so even though I'm bounded by even though we're bounded by um, these anxieties can you can find that freedom within the other, by it. So basically, your anxiety points to that freedom, or can be found in that freedom of the other, in this sort of relation. So that's kind of what I mean by we can construct our relationships reciprocally by our anxieties. And if we do that, we can find a real, maybe a real genuine freedom within our personal relations with each other. Right? It's sort of, it would just sort of just be like this practice of, like, in a real personable sense, it would be like this practice of, like, I just want to remind you, like, I need you as a person, right? Like, this would be like what I would be saying to, like, my partner, like, I just want to remind you that I need you as a partner. And her would be like, I just want to remind you that you don't take so much energy away from me for you to be afraid to present a problem to me, you know. Um, so it's, again, like, I typically try to root a lot of my philosophical explorations within my personal life. Um, this is going to be a slight deviation, but lately I've been having a lot of thoughts about, like, now that I'm in a relationship, and my reorientation to philosophy and theology, and one of those reorientations is the fact that um, I personally don't feel like I'm smart enough to be a philosophical genius, or whatever the case. And maybe it's even sloppy or naive to even believe in that, and believe that's something that you should pursue. But The question still remains: should philosophy, where should philosophy's place be in my life, and theology, and so on? And my best answer to that is, if philosophy is a part of your life, then your task is to incorporate it somehow. Um, and it's what I call weak philosophy. I call it weak philosophy because I feel like philosophy is very personable, which I guess you could take. I take the more Nietzschean position where, like, our philosophies are very autobiographical about ourselves. So it sort of represents a kind of genealogy of ourselves. Um, and so the best that I can do as a mediocre or philosopher is just, to my best ability, construct my worldview, and also be willing to understand that whatever I construct is always going to be, in some sense, inefficient. It's going to be has a kind of deficiency to it because it is always a weak philosophy. But it's a weak philosophy because it corresponds to a tension that I always experience in my own life, right? The fact that there's always these problems that emerge as a human being. So once you take your life as a philosophical problem, and this is not to reduce your life to a philosophical abstraction, but actually to understand that there's a lot of abstractions in your life that you take as concrete. So it's actually probably the inverse. Um, you can make your life more concrete by this practice of taking your life as a philosophical problem, because even if you logically conclude to a solution, right? Like, for example, if I feel like Buber's dialogue is the way that we should approach understanding each other, right? Like seeing the other as other. If I feel like that's Buber's solution, well, the thing is, Buber's solution is always, in essence, a problem, right? Because the other as a problem is what is contingent on the solution. So that means that no matter what I do, even if the solution is ideally the dialogue with the other is always persistently a problem for me because of that. So even if logically we come up with solutions, these solutions always transform themselves into persistent and perpetual problems, or perpetual transformations of new problems. And so taking your life as a philosophical problem is to sort of always raise the question, and always understand that even if you logically come up with what you believe to be a solution, it fundamentally always transforms itself as a problem. And whether you can or cannot actually perform your solution is another problem that is constantly raised. Can I actually perform? Can I enact my solution that I truly believe in, or philosophically justify, and so on? So, to me, you know, I, I resign myself to maybe not um, solving the problems of the world in a kind of uh, humility kind of way. Like I mean, it's not to say that people shouldn't try to solve the problems of the world. I think, from observing my own capacity, I don't think that's my realm of reach. You know, um, I very much consider myself to be like a sort of layman, limited kind of like intellectual person that I I don't feel like I can give an adequate, or even if I know it's never going to be an adequate, I just don't feel confident enough to give a very great exposition on how society functions and how it should function. I just don't have that ability in me. Um, but it still remains, right? It's still a question of how do I um, make room for philosophy in my life, and where should that reside? if I accept that I'm no intellectual giant in this sphere of the world. And if you're no intellectual giant, it almost poses an even bigger problem, because it's like, well, um, if I'm not constructing, methods and systems to reframe and basically kind of save the world from dangerous assumptions and positions, then what then is my task? And well, I guess my task for myself is to construct the best worldview that I can for my reality, my interpersonal relationships with people and things, like my relationship to work, my relationship to philosophy and so on. Like, this is sort of the Kierkegaardian relative absolute relation that I think Kierkegaard typically advocates for, um, in my opinion, if people grant me that. So yeah, I think that's the whole concept of weak philosophy that I call. It's not really. Um, it may sound new, but it's really like the same concept of saying, like, I'm just doing the best that I can as a person. Um, and I understand that there's so many genealogies that I could come from, right? Like, the fact that I could favor Hegel, Kant, Nietzsche, and construct a philosophy from them that might be helpful. But then, there's always this question of, like, why is it that I'm particularly attracted to certain thinkers and then not particularly attracted to some? And how I already have a sort of genealogy that's rooting myself as a thinker, right? Like, people know me now as, like, somebody that's kind of like read Julie Resch, Emile Cioran, Martin Buber. You know, uh, so many people kind of understand, like, okay, this is where Javier's coming from. This is his position. This is his kind of genealogy of thinking. And then yet, we can't escape this kind of genealogy of history, right? With thinkers and the way that we interact with each other. And for a long time, I've been so frustrated with that fact that, like, every time I discuss philosophy with people, I feel like all I hear is their genealogy. For example, like, I've been reading Monstrosity of Christ with the debate between Zizek and John Milbank, and it's like, just looking at from the outside, it's like Zizek is obviously coming from, like, Lacan, Hegel, and, like, his interpretations of, like, these more patristic fathers, St. Augustine, and all this other stuff. And then you see John Milbank, and he's completely coming from, like, another different genealogy of history, where, like, his thinkers are, like, more like Kierkegaard and, like, um, is it Yurguna, and, like, all these other thinkers. And it's, like, super fascinating, because you're like, oh wow, like, this genealogy of history between these two thinkers really starts painting a fundamental deviation in their interpretation and the way they kind of view the world. Um, and you're sort of left with, like, well, as you're reading it, you're like, well, I'm not really sure what's more convincing. And it really is a kind of, like, gamble. And this is actually something my partner raised when I was telling her about this on our walk today. My partner was like, you know, she's like, she has a very hard time of, like, not seeing, like, she has a very hard time, like, digesting the fact that she feels like it's just people's just mere whims, right? Like, you chose this thinker that you like, and you feel like he's a better position than the other position that is opposed to yours. And that's technically all she hears when I present this framework that Zizek and both John Milbank are coming from in the Monstrosity of Christ. And in some sense, it's true, right? Like, we can't escape the genealogical history of intellectual thinkers, right? Like, it seems like the way a thinker is known is precisely almost by their genealogy of, like, where they're coming from. and how they interpret like Heidegger and Hegel and St. Augustine and like all these other thinkers, and then like how they privilege certain thinkers over others, and then their specific interpretations sort of privilege other understandings, and conclusions. Um, and it's very difficult for my partner to be like, okay, but like, is there really like objective truth out there? Um, and I found it, ironically, very difficult to answer that question for her, because I was like, well, I mean, you know, people have answered this in several ways, which ironically still doesn't help her position, because she's like, again, I just feel like this is just sort of people's whims, um, on the position. And I agree, you know, I agree with her, that it is, because, at the very fundamental level, um, you can't escape the fact that at the very bottom of the foundation of our thinking, that it really just comes to like a matter of choice and faith, kind of fidelity to, what we decide to bring forth to the conversation. Um, but I think that's why I appreciate thinkers like Martin Buber, and a kind of dialogue of kenosis, self-emptying, because, um, I think if we're wary of the fact that we are thinkers that kind of have built a kind of genealogy of our own philosophy, then, um, we should also leave room for the self-emptying of ourselves to have another, voice be present, right? Another voice appear as, another possibility of understanding the world. Um, and I know she's probably struggling with some of the same things that I struggled in, um, because for a while, I couldn't help but hear people's sort of egotistical genealogies from their philosophy, their philosophizing. But then I also started understanding like there's just really no benefit to, um, having this cynical view anymore, because it just doesn't like contribute to like it just there's just it's just an end, right? There's just no constructive anything to it, right? Like that's it. Um, it's like cool if I accept everyone's egotistical, everybody's preaching their genealogical philosophical understanding of their favorite thinkers and how they interpret certain thinkers, then like okay, like that's it. That there's nothing else to the conversation then. And then what's the point of doing all of this? So you quickly see like it's a kind of futile position to hold. Whereas we could reframe it as like, well, maybe there's just maybe there's you know maybe there's a good reason for this. Maybe there's like a good understanding for this, pluralism or difference to deal with and grapple with as a human being. Um, so yeah, I think it's good to go through the realization that there is a lot of egotistical genealogical histories of people's philosophy, which is fine. Um, but then I also think, despite that truth, um, there is still something being said, and I guess the question is how open we are to that question of being said, which is why I promoted the initial like maybe dialogue is supposed to be this sort of act of self kenosis where we self empty enough to leave room for the other, so that way we can maybe engage rather than reducing them to a sort of egotistical genealogy of history, which of course is my own, reading of Martin Buber, right? Like the fact that this exists and that this is a problem. Um, it's very hard for me to leave Buber behind. I have to admit that. But I think, my interpretations of Martin Buber is more catered on the impossible, if that makes any sense. Like, because a lot of people go like, "Oh, Buber was too idealistic. Like, he wanted mutuality and to see the other and so on." Um, uh, Buber admits that. mutual seeing the other is actually a part of grace, on his like what he understood as grace. But I think it's more about a mutual openness that could cultivate. But even if it's not mutually open, I think just striving for that impossible mutuality is worth striving for, anyways. Um, and I think Buber's argument is enough to say that it is possible. It just it just means that we're not fully in control of it. We're not fully able to do it ourselves. There is an element of grace in that. So even though people accuse Buber for being idealistic or too utopic or whatever, I fully believe in the vision of the impossible, meaning like even if it's not possible, it's still worth striving for that impossibility. And it could be possible that the impossible allows itself to become possible within those glimmers of 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 grace, or whatever. Like it can be possible if you strive for that impossibility, but it just doesn't guarantee its possibility or its actuality. Let me put it that way. It doesn't guarantee its actuality, which is my understanding of Buber. But I think people are sort of uncharitable to uh, Buber's vision of dialogue in some sense, because I think it's more about striving for that impossibility of mutuality and dialogue that is worth striving for. I think he places enough arguments to say that glimmers can happen. If I'm using OG Rose language, glimmers can happen, glimmers are possible, but it's not directly in our control. And that is also part of the reason of dialogue that Buber talks about. There is no standard for dialogue, which is why you're completely open, you're completely vulnerable, you're completely not in control. And Buber admits it sort of resembles a kind of suffering, like a kind of openness to the other, vulnerability, and so on. Um, so yeah, but other than that, I know I kind of I digressed a little bit. Um, yeah, I think weak philosophy is just kind of taking your life as a philosophical problem, and that's it, right? I definitely think there's philosophers that are, if they want to pursue a more general framework of like they feel like this certain method is what will solve some of the issues with the world, that's fine. I'm not going to be pessimistic about that worldview anymore. Like I'm tired of that pessimism, you could say. I'm really embracing even Sharon's kind of notion of exhaustion. Like it's good to exhaust a kind of framework and then just move on, right? Just move on. Um, it really is similar to my thinking, anyways, where it's like I think as much as I praise Buber, I've exhausted Buber to the extent like even though Buber may say like, no, I think mutuality is possible, I would reframe it as no, mutuality is completely impossible because of asymmetrical relations. But I'm charitable enough to understand that the impossible is worth striving for, which is precisely what, in my opinion, Buber is saying, versus maybe Buber's actual words. Um, so yeah, so so that's why I reframe it as like, if people want to solve the world's problems, I'm not opposed. Which is also kind of my borrowing from Julie Resch's thinking, where it's like, even though Julie Resch's thinking doesn't give you a method of how you choose, because everything is fundamentally futile and negative. What is beautiful about that framework is that it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to do the opposite. Because a lot of people ask her like, hey, like, well, if we have these political issues, does it mean like because it's futile that we just shouldn't do it? And I know Julie Resch would disagree with this, but I think she's very ironically very close to Iris Murdoch's understanding of the good, where it's like the good is for nothing. So if you're going to do this project, just understand it's for nothing, but more incentive to do it, ironically. Or I can give another example of just like something that happened in my own relationship with my partner, where we started to acknowledge like, okay, maybe we should lay out our anxieties on the table, because, well, if we don't lay them out on the table, then we are guaranteed to fail. But if we risk um, putting these on the table with each other, then we also present the possibility of it working out, even though there's always the risk of it not working out anyways, right? But at least this alternative allows for the possibility of it working out despite a possible futility. And maybe that's the sort of difference with Julie Resch's thinking, is like, there is futility at the end of the day, but there is still this maybe finite possibility of risk. Like it's basically futile in the sense that we always have to risk, and we risk futility anyways. If futility is always at the end, but it's worth risking that good, which is very kind of like Pascal's wager. I think Julie Resch's fundamental philosophy actually presents a very good Pascalian wager. Like, yeah, if there's nothing and there's negativity all the way at the core, then there's also no harm in risking for the good, right? There's no harm in risking it at all. There's no harm in risking that the possibility of that infinite good. If I were to just, instead of, if I were to abstract Pascal's wager from God for a moment and then incorporate Julie's Resch, I mean, if it's futile at the end, then taking seriously the good for nothing is, well, to me, that elevates the good to an even higher status, because it is good for nothing, in my opinion. And if the nothing itself is infinite and void, as maybe Julie Resch would point out, then maybe that is the framework that we should be going, like the good for nothing, the sort of infinite possibility is there, despite the futility, despite the nothing, right there. So maybe that's that's something that I've done. I think that's what I enjoy about my own thinking. And I mean this in like a very non-narcissistic way. I mean this like in a kind of like, I enjoy my thinking process about this because I find a way to keep these thinkers close to me, because I find these thinkers very important. But I think after a while of sort of thinking about them and thinking about their conclusions, I transform them into something that feels more tangible to me, and more corresponding to my thought, right? Because it's not only that their thought determines me, I also reciprocally determine them. So I think that's what's beautiful, and I think that's kind of like what I'm talking about with like weak philosophy. It's to get to that point where I'm being determined by the people that I read, yes, but also I am determining them, which makes me can make me a unique thinker in that process. And I think that's what's ironically very beautiful about like reading thinkers like Zizek and John Milbank, and how they come across the same thinkers maybe, and how it determines them, and yet how they determine that reading and interpretation. And to me, I think that's the most beautiful thing. If we decide to kind of free ourselves from the ethical boundaries that we typically confine ourselves in, it can be a beautiful thing to appreciate, I would say, to appreciate this difference in a kind of aesthetic manner. But of course, we are bounded by ethical and structural necessity, so it makes these conversations all the more risky and threatening. and problematic. But if we momentarily free ourselves from that necessity, or understand that there is always something more than this necessity, there is room for that appreciation. There is room for that aesthetic of appreciation, which I would say is also paired with what I understand as weak philosophy. Um, but yeah, I think that's it. For a while, I've taken my writing as sort of inspired thinking, and I know a lot of people critique some people. Well, not people that I know, but there's a lot of writers that critique inspired thinking or inspired writing. But I would only counter with the fact that I find my life riddled with so many problems that I don't need to wait for inspiration. It's there. It's a matter of paying attention, really. Like all my philosophical issues and problems are right there in front of me. Those are the very sources of my writing and my thinking. And I'm no longer afraid to make it personal, like a kind of like diary or journal. And I'm no longer afraid of making it maybe a little bit impersonal, as almost to portray a kind of like, I think this is the problem of the world. Um, and I think that's the contradiction that I'm also trying to portray in my writing, where it's like it just sounds like I've solved the world's problems by giving some impersonable observation, but it's always personable. And yet I must attempt to describe the world and must seem like I prescribe the world, in my attempt to unify my worldview or give some type of coherence to my worldview despite the contradiction that is always there. Um, but yeah, I think that's it. Um, thank you guys for watching. All right. Take care. Bye.